Today is Tuesday, April the 6th, 2004. This is the beginning of a videotaped interview with Leon Sandy Sembach at his home at 106 Broken Iron Court, Lake of the Woods, Virginia. My name is Elaine Chambers, and I will be the interviewer of Leon Sandy Sembach during this taped interview session. The videographer is Dick Martin. This taped interview is part of the Veteran History Project being produced by the AARP and Korean War Veterans Association local chapters here at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Leon Sandy Sembach is 83 years old and was born on November 1st, 1920. Mr. Sembach, for the record, please tell us what war you served in, the branch of the service that you served in, what was your rank, and where did you serve?
Well, I was in the Army, and I was Field Artillery, and I served in both World War II and Korea. In World War II, I was in the European Theater of Operations. Of course, in the Korean War, I was on the Korean Peninsula.
And what was your rank?
Well, I started out as a private in the Army back in 1939. And during World War II, I was a first lieutenant, and in Korea, I was a major.
And what were you when you retired?
I retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1964.
Okay, very good. And did you enlist in the Army, or were you drafted?
No, I enlisted in the Army. I wanted to get out of the coal mines of Pennsylvania, and I also wanted to get a college education. The only way I could see getting it was to get into one of the service academies. So I enlisted in the Army to try to get into West Point through the Army.
Okay, I believe you have a picture there of you when you graduated. This is you when you graduated from West Point?
This is when I graduated in 1943. I entered I entered West Point in 1940 on an regular Army appointment. And during my yearling year, my sophomore year, Pearl Harbor happened. And so our course was cut from 4 years to 3 years. They took away all of our spare time, our vacations, and crammed all the academics they could into the remaining year. So we graduated in 1943 instead of 1944.
Okay, so you graduated from West Point as a second lieutenant.
As second lieutenant.
And where did you go after you graduated?
Well, I went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma, for the basic artillery officers course. And when I completed that, I was assigned to a Field Artillery Battalion, the 179th Field Artillery Battalion, which was stationed there as school troops at Fort Sill. And I stayed there until I was assigned around January of 1944 to the 755th Field Artillery Battalion, which was a 155 millimeter howitzer battalion.
And then from there, when did you go overseas?
We sailed from New York in August of 1944. That was after, you remember, D-Day happened in June of 1944. So we sailed in August, and we landed up in Scotland, and then we took a train down to the south coast of England. And we were there in County Devon, and we stayed there until September, at which time we took LSTs and crossed the channel at Omaha Beach.
Okay, an LST, what does that mean?
Well, that was a small landing craft. We had a battalion of 500 men and 12 big howitzers, plus ammunition trains and all kind of administrative vehicles.
And they all went on the LST?
We all went on 2 LSTs.
Okay, and then you had to wade ashore from...
We didn't have, well, no, we were very fortunate because the beaches had been very well cleared by then. There was a lot of debris around and floating mines and surprisingly a lot of floating dead. But we were able to pull the LST right up in the beach at high tide and drop the doors, and we were able to just roll right off without getting wet.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about what your job was in the battalion.
Well, I was assigned to one of the firing batteries, A battery, and I was what is officially known as a reconnaissance and survey officer. I had several duties. The survey part of it was that I would survey in the guns because of the old-fashioned system that we had in those days. You had to survey in the guns to find out where their location was with respect to other guns and with respect to targets. When I was, as a reconnaissance officer, I was an observer. I would go either as a forward observer with the infantry and the tanks and find targets and then call back to the guns and adjust their fire on the targets. Or I could have what they called a general purpose type of observation post where I might be 2,000-3,000 yards from the front line, but I'd be at a high point which I could see more of the battlefield and see deeper into the battlefield, deeper and mostly deeper into the enemy rear.
Okay, well, it sounds like it was a very responsible job, and I'm sure that you had quite a few experiences, maybe some stories that we didn't read about in the newspaper or the magazines. So if you'd like to tell us a couple of your experiences, maybe starting where you went into Holland.
Well, we joined 9th Army, which was just being formed at that time. And we went into the line between the British Army and the 1st Army. That took us across Holland. And we went through the coal fields of Holland and into the coal fields of Germany. And at that point, I was, one of my jobs was to be with the 82nd Armored Recon Squadron. That was the recon squadron for the 2nd Armored Division. And that recon squadron would go out in front of the main body until they bumped into a little bit of resistance and then would stop. But the job of the recon squadron was to feel out the enemy and find out where he was. So I went with them. And then another time I had an observation post that was maybe at Alsdorf, which was probably 1,000 yards from the front line, and that was a big slag pile. And the problem with the slag piles was that the Germans had them all surveyed in, and when we get to the top of these conical shaped piles of slag, the Germans would fire anti-aircraft at us, and they were hot spots. And I was glad to get out of that one. And then they moved, as we were just getting through the west wall, as we crossed from Holland into Germany. Then from there, I went to a wooden tower at a place called Bastogne. Now that was maybe 3,000 yards from the front. But you see, all that land was so flat. So the only places you could really get a good observation post when you're in that sort of a general observation post was to find a church steeple or the top of a slag pile or the top of some other building that was tall. And of course the Germans knew that too. So they had them all pretty well zeroed in. So anyway, I got over there to Bastogne, which was in the sector of the 29th and 30th Divisions, because having just cracked that part of the west wall, 9th Army was trying to move forward to the Roer River. And it was at that, while I was on that observation post, that I was called back to the battalion for the move down to Belgium.
Okay. You want to show it now, or do you want to wait?
I'll wait.
Okay. So now you're going down to Belgium, and you're down around the Roer River?
No. When
Up by the Roer River.
yeah, we were heading into Germany, and we were moving towards the Roer River, and while we were trying to do that, around the 16th of December, the Germans launched their big counteroffensive through the Ardennes. I was called back from my observation post to the battalion headquarters, and when I got there, I was told that I was not going to go to another OP, that the whole battalion was moving south, that the Germans had broken through. So we mounted up on our vehicles and we started going south into the sector. We traveled about 60 to 80 miles, and we got down into Belgium. And at the time, you could tell that something was going wrong because we people who had frontline experience, we knew the difference between what a mortar shell sounded like and what an artillery shell sounded like, or a bomb drop from an airplane. And so the Germans had a lot of small reconnaissance outfits that were slicing through and cutting up columns. But we were lucky. We got down there. I think we may have lost our service battery, which had all our ammunition and a lot of our supplies. But we got down there all right. When we got down there, we got in the vicinity of front of Bastogne. You see, the Germans were coming from the east. And anyway, we went down. We came to an area around Bastogne. The Germans had broken through from this direction, coming from the east. And our battalion went into position down here at a place called Villerue. Now, I was sent as a forward observer with these paratroopers that were out here on the east side of Bastogne. You see, from here, we were shooting that way. This paratroop battalion came under some good German infantry attacks, but they held them real well. While I was trying to contact my battalion by radio and by wire, the wire went out. When I got on the radio, the Germans started jamming my radio and even inserting false commands to my guns. So then all of a sudden my radio went out, and I and my scout corporal and my radio operator were standing by the Jeep, and the Germans were trying to bypass Bastogne. Now my radio went out. So my scout corporal and my radio operator and I were standing by the Jeep, trying to figure out how we could get this radio on so we could get contact with my battalion. Now we were in full view of the Germans that were bypassing Bastogne. They were only at the most 1,000 yards away, and they were shelling our positions, but I didn't think they were pinpointing me. But all of a sudden a round came in, hit near us. The concussion knocked me flat. I got a few scratches from it. Didn't hurt either of my two corporals, but it shattered the radio and it gave me a flat tire. So I had to go back to my battalion down there at Villerue to get a new radio, and fortunately I had a spare tire. So we took off, and my scout corporal and I took off, and we went into Bastogne from here in. And as we got to the periphery of the town itself, somebody out of a basement window, I heard a click of a machine gun, and someone hollered, "Halt!" And right away, these American soldiers started coming out and querying me and my corporal to ascertain whether we were actually Americans or whether we were Germans, because I didn't know the password. But I did know enough Americanese, so I convinced them that we were indeed Americans. So we passed through Bastogne, and we went down to found my way to Villerue. Now, the problem, when I got to Villerue and they were replacing my radio, a lot of artillery shells and mortar shells started coming in. And I was standing near my battalion commander, Colonel Hartman, and he said, "Boy, that artillery's coming close." And I said, "No, sir, that's not artillery. They are mortars. So if mortars are hitting us, the enemy must be pretty close." So he told me to go out and establish a listening post outside on the battalion perimeter to find out what was going on. So I went down. Unfortunately, to get to that outpost, I had to go through my own battery, Battery A. And I told my scout corporals who I left were there to cover me. And I went out about 100, 200 yards from the guns, and I found a slit trench that had already been dug. And as I looked into the woods, I could see the Germans moving into the woods. And suddenly the shelling on our guns, on the artillery pieces behind me, got very heavy. I had no communications with the battalion anymore. And so I decided to get back to the guns. And when I ran on my way back to the guns about halfway, I bumped into one of our 3/4-ton trucks. And in the back of the truck was one of our machine gunners, Wright. His name was Wright. And I told him, I said, look, can you fire that machine gun and cover, and I'll get in the truck and I'll see if I can get it back. Well, I got in the truck, and I couldn't get it started. But that man Wright saved my life because he covered me when I came from my hole back to the 3/4-ton truck, and then we both got into the firing battery area. When we got into the firing battery area, I bumped into my battery commander. I told him, he said, yes, we know we're in trouble. The rest of the battalion is displacing, and we're going to displace too. So he said, now, the battery executive officer, Lieutenant Candell, has been wounded, and we've evacuated him. I said, well, where's my scout corporals? He said, well, they've been wounded. Maitner and Gibson have been wounded, and they've been evacuated to the battalion aid station. They were hit pretty badly. So he said, can you take over the guns as the battery executive officer? I said, sure. So I was very fortunate. I had a very good chief of guns, Sergeant Wilhelm. And I talked to him on the telephones, and I knew that I soon found out that one of the mortar shells had hit the 4 pieces. We had 4 155 howitzers, and one of them had taken a direct hit. So, and also just 100 or 200 yards from the guns, these Germans were ready to launch an attack on us. So I told Sergeant Wilhelm, I said, look, I know you can't get out 4 guns. You don't have the crews, but they're on the flank where the Germans are coming. So let's get 3 of them out at least. Get out what we can and disable the 4th one. Fortunately, at that time, up on a ridge behind us, there arrived 2 tanks. And they started shooting over our heads at the Germans that were 100, 200 yards away in the woods. So that pinned those Germans down. And that enabled us to jack down our guns. You know, these are big 155 howitzers. They're not self-propelled. You have to jack them down, close the trails, and hook them up to the prime mover. And that takes time and exposes you very much. But fortunately, we got out of there because the tanks above us were holding off the enemy, and also the headquarters of a sister battalion, the 969th Artillery Battalion, which was a black battalion. They also helped holding off. So we were the rear guard action, and we held that roadblock with the help of the 2 tanks while the rest of the battalions, the 969th and our 755th, got on the road. We went back to a town called Sembach. It was right in here, in Bastogne. Don't forget now, the enemy, meanwhile, had surrounded all around Bastogne. So anyway, we got to Sembach, and we stayed there probably maybe a day, if that. But that was getting too exposed also. You have to remember, this was a very fluid situation around Bastogne. There was all kind of units, American and German, floating through this very fluid situation. So then this battle at Villeroo had occurred around the 21st or 22nd of December. And then finally, back here at headquarters of the 101st Airborne, they realized that they were going to have to try to do something about solidifying this, getting some sort of a line around it. It wasn't a solid line around there of troops, but that we could have strong points. So they moved us, the Sembach, right inside the line. Now, it was pretty foggy around that time, and troops, enemy patrols would drift in on you, and you wouldn't know they were there until they got on top of you. And then you fought hand-to-hand, gun-to-gun, whatever you had. But we didn't lose people there. Finally, on I think it was the 23rd, that it snowed. And no, it snowed before that. But then on the 23rd, the skies opened up. And the Air Force was able to come out. And the P-47s came out. And they blasted a lot of the German troops that were encircling Bastogne. And it also enabled the C-47s to come in and make parachute drops of supplies to us. But we still were very short of ammunition. We were very short of food. We certainly were short of medical help because we had lost the division which was supposed to establish the hospital. They had lost a lot of their people in one of the attacks. So we didn't even have a full complement of medical people. Although in my battery, I had a PFC Russo who later got, I think, a Silver Star because he was very good at helping the wounded when they were dropping, and he certainly deserved it. Now, on the 25th, what we didn't know was happening to us is, sometime before the 25th, a chaplain came up and said he was going to, Catholic chaplain, he wanted to say Mass. I said, well, Padre, every time we stick our heads out here, the snipers over here are shooting at us, or they pop rounds into this house. I had established my command post in a farmhouse, and the foundation, which is above the ground foundation, was stone and mortar, but above it was just wood. I told him if he wanted to, he could have the Mass inside my CP, because incidentally, that's where the animals had formerly been. So he said, no, there was not enough room in there. He was going to have it upstairs. I said, Padre, I don't think we're going to make it. He said, trust me, or with that effect. So we spread the word around to the troops in the area. There's going to be Mass up in the top floor of this farmhouse. And he did. The chaplain, a young fella, he set his altar up in one bedroom, and we were in the other bedroom. It was a very quick confession, and it was a very quick Mass, but we got through with it without a round being fired. Now, what we didn't know was on Christmas morning, we didn't know the Germans had planned an attack. They knew they were stopped here. They coming from Germany into here, they were stopped. And when they tried to go any other way, around the north and around, they were having problems up here too. But it was soft. The back of Bastogne and the south it was soft. So they decided that they would come around and they would throw a main attack in here and then the secondary attack down here. What we didn't know was at the time that we of the 755th were right in the path of this secondary attack. On Christmas morning, Wright, that same machine gunner that saved my life down in Villaroo, Wright called me on the phone. We had him out in the flank of the guns. He said, Lieutenant, I hear tanks coming. They don't sound like ours. What should I do? I said, Wright, if they're not ours, you shoot them. As soon as you know they're not ours, you make them button up. Well, I no sooner said that than a lot of machine gun fire started hitting my CP and also shell fire. Now, fortunately, they blew a lot of stuff through the doors and the windows, but none of us got hurt. But while we were under attack, there was 4 light tanks and had stumbled in our position, I think. The cannoneers and the battery executive officer from the other firing battery saw these tanks coming at us. So they sneaked up with their bazookas and they knocked the tanks out. And when the tanks got knocked out, about 50 infantrymen in white with white jackets on came down and surrendered.
These are Germans.
Germans. And we passed them on and somebody took them back. I don't know what happened then, but we got through that. And that was a hairy experience. But our cannoneers did a good job, and I say Charlie Battery did a good job too. And Christmas Day, then didn't turn out so badly. The commanding general of Bastogne, General McAuliffe, sent down a big case of wine, and it came with a note that said compliments of the commanding general. By this time, we had heard about his saying, when he was given the ultimatum to surrender, General McAuliffe had given the word nuts. We're not surrendering. Well, he had been ordered not to, and I don't think we knew at the time what dire straits we were in. But anyway, it was, I think, on the 26th, the next day or two after Christmas, the 4th Armored Division from Patton's army punched a hole through the Germans and got to us, and then reinforcements start pushing into Bastogne, and we were okay. Then after that, the 101st was put into the line to help push the Germans back into Germany, and we supported them until Patton then transferred us to 3rd Army.
Wow, that's a very good story. I think then you traveled on towards Germany and
well,
the
yes,
Rhine River.
Yeah, well, before that, we helped Patton and his army and close the Bulge, pinch it off, and then somewhere, I guess maybe, and that time was a very hard time because a lot of those roads over there are cobblestone, and you get in very cold weather. If you don't have the right thing on your prime movers, in our case, the prime movers were tracks. The trucks had chains, but even so, the cobblestones would get ice over, and we would have a heck of a time getting through there because the slightest hill you got over, you start going down that hill, it was like sleigh riding and jackknifing. And we were cold and hungry, but I'll say we moved a lot. And moving a lot meant you had to do a lot of hard work with the guns. But I'll say one thing about it. When Patton had us moving so fast, nobody could shoot back at us. The only time we would get shot at would be when we'd come across some pocket of resistance that had been left behind by the Germans or forgotten, whatever. So that was a good learning experience. Then we were transferred back to 9th Army, which was our parent army, finally able to get showers again. Hadn't had showers for maybe 2 months, 3 months. And we got back there to 9th Army, and we were getting ready then to push forward. They had gotten to the Roer River, and they were now getting ready to push to the Rhine. So we pushed to the Rhine, and then then the airdrop at Wesel, our paratroopers dropped over the Rhine, across from Wesel. And our battalion, the 755th Field Artillery Battalion, was in the link-up forces. So the engineers had done the wonderful job of putting those pontoon bridges across the Rhine. And remember, this was the spring of the year, and the Rhine was swollen. It was a lot of water, and not only that, all that snow melting back in the Alps made that water very, very cold. So there was no hope for you if anything happened to those bridges. The pontoon bridges had rubber rafts on them, and it didn't take much to puncture them. So I was in the link-up force, and seeing that I was now the battery executive officer of A Battery, and I had been now with 4 guns again, we led the artillery link-up to go across. You see, the problem with the airborne troops, both those at Bastogne and those that made the drop over the Rhine, is that they had 105 millimeter howitzers. Their range, I don't remember now, but they were probably only 8,000, maybe 8,000 yards at most, maybe 7,000. Whereas with 155 howitzers, we could fire 16,500 yards. Not only that, we had heavier shells, and we could do more damage. So that's why they needed us in the link-up force. We pushed up towards Munster, and when we got up around there again, our only problems were these pockets of resistance that would somehow or another get bypassed, and they were just waiting there to take on some of us. You know, an artillery column, when it's on the road, is very vulnerable. But we got through that rather well without too many casualties of any sort. It was about this time that I had found out about my the battery executive, Lieutenant Candell, the Graves registration people were coming around checking on certain things, and they found out that Lieutenant Candell had been killed. He had been evacuated to the hospital in Bastogne, but during one of the bombing raids, the wall fell in on him. When the wall fell in, though, it fell over one of our cooks. So, and that's how I learned about that. And then I was shown a pair of OD trousers, had my name in it, I mean, laundry mark and all. And I was asked if they're my trousers, and I said yes. What the bottom line is, one of my scout corporals, Gene Maitner, had borrowed them from me. We swapped clothes like that, shoes, and he had been found dead in a field. His body had been found in the field outside of Villaroo. Evidently, he had died in the aid station, and the Germans just put him out in the field. But and the other way I identified him was by he had a bridge of some of his teeth, and every time we'd be in the observation post, if he'd be looking through the BC scope of the binoculars, he had a nervous habit of always clicking them. So I could identify him real well, and I could say, yes, they're my trousers, but here I am, it's not me. And the other one, Gibson, had also died in a similar fashion. So from then on, the 84th, we got behind the 84th and the Infantry Division and the 5th Armored Division, and then we were racing for the Elbe. And that also had its dangers. It had its dangers because, as always, when you haul and when you bypass, you're going to leave pockets of resistance behind. And so we had some problems like that. But the other thing we started noticing were all the prisoners of war that were being taken up front. And about all that our troops could do was tell the prisoners of war to come down the ditches, just, throw your weapons down and just march back to our rear and turn yourselves in back there. And there were a lot of them. When we were there around the end of April, beginning of May, just before the end of the war, there was a need for people in the military government. They needed linguists. They needed people who had been administrators and with civil functions, doctors, lawyers. And my group commander, probably the only other regular Army officer in the whole Field Artillery group besides me, said, Lieutenant, you're not going home when this war's over. You're regular Army, you're going to have to stay here. And you should volunteer for military government because that'll be a good experience for you. But he said, second, look at your record. We understand that you're now speaking good German. You've studied French, you've studied Spanish, you've studied Portuguese. I said, Colonel, I almost flunked out of West Point on French. He said, that's all right. It doesn't say that on your record. So he said, you volunteer, maybe they can use you. So about a week or two before the end of the war, I got orders to report back to the rear to a military government detachment. And it was sort of sad saying goodbye to my old battery commander, Captain Harold Calhoun Stanley, and to all the troops, all the men, because we hadn't been together a long, long time, but the time we had been together, we went to hell and back. And they were all good soldiers.
So now it's after the war. The war was over shortly after that?
After that, I was assigned to a detachment, a military government detachment, had two captains and myself, a first lieutenant, and about 6 enlisted men. Our detachment commander was a captain, had been a Field Artillery Battalion S2 or S3. He had his PhD in economics and government, spoke German. Then the other captain had been a principal. He had been an engineer company commander, but he had taught schools down in Mississippi. And I was a third officer. I could speak German. So I was assigned the duties of public safety officer. My job at the county level was to organize police departments, fire departments, the prisons, and also transportation systems because we had to register all the vehicles. So that fell under public safety.
Where were you? What part of Germany were you
Well,
in?
the first time we were assigned to the British because they were waiting to get all our people back from the Empire. And we went up to Munster. And we had the county of Munster. And then after we were there a couple of months and got things pretty well organized, we were relieved by the British, and we went to our American outfits, which are now in the state of Hessen, Land Hessen. Our first county there was Hunfeld, which was a little rural county. But that was a problem because it bordered Thuringia. And around September, the Americans were giving up the Thuringia to the Russians. And so all the refugees were flooding towards the American zone. And I've been in one of the counties on that zone. We got a lot of refugees, and they were in very bad shape. So that was our big problem. Displaced persons was a big problem. They were a big problem because some of them did want to go home, but a lot of them didn't want to go home. A lot of them had been slave labor, but a lot of them had come voluntarily because they had a choice. You either go with the Russians and the Soviets, or you go with the Germans. And for a lot of them, middle-class people, educated people, that wasn't much of a choice. So as far as lawlessness goes, we didn't, the Germans were not rioting. They were not in very good shape food-wise, but they all pitched in. They started cleaning up their towns. They were easy to organize because they knew that that's what they had to do, to survive. Now, when I was in Hunfeld, a young cavalry officer named Quinlivan came in to me, and he had a German with him, and introduced himself, and said, the Mansbach stud farm is up in your Landkreis, your county. I said, yes, I know about it. Sorry I didn't get up to see you guys. But what brings you here? He said, well, we have the horses up there that Patton had been surrendered to Patton. And he brought them out of Austria or Czechoslovakia, wherever they were. He's brought them up here to Mansbach. And he said, we not only have the Lipizzaner mares, but we also have the Cossack ponies. With these Hungarian Cossacks came with them. We got some thoroughbred English horses. So we get quite a mixture. But we need fodder. And all the farmers up there tell us the only way they can give it to us for the horses is if you military government sign the paper. I said, give me a paper. Got the girl and we signed a paper. But we became good friends. And we had quite a lot of hunts, rides up there, riding horses. I had equitation at West Point, but it didn't prepare me for riding with those real purebred Germans who could really ride. Now, the two officers, or the two veterinarians that came with the horses, were Dr. Kroll and Dr. Lessing. They had been in the German army, and they were veterinarians. They were in charge of these horses. And so when Patton got the horses, he got the two veterinarians with them too. So that was a good thing. From there we went down to Fulda. And Fulda was in the Fulda Gap. It's now known as the Fulda Gap, the avenue of approach by which the Soviet army could come into Germany. And by then we knew, and I think the Germans knew and we knew, that our real enemy was the Soviet Union. It wasn't the Germans. And so we had a mutual goal, both of us, or a mutual enemy. And Morgenthau had, one of the cabinet members of FDR, he had this policy of reducing Germany to an agrarian society. And we start realizing pretty soon, look, you can't do that because they only have so much farmland, and that's well taken care of. And so let's not, we just didn't like the idea. You couldn't take everybody and make farmers out of them. We had the denazification problem, but You know, the way it was over there, and I have no sympathy for the Nazis, because I did go by concentration camps, and I'll never forget the smell of them, if anything else. But you know, for ordinary people, they were, if you wanted your boy to go to the Naval Academy, or you were a teacher and you wanted to remain a teacher, you either joined the party or you joined one of the subsidiaries. I was fortunate in one case in which back at Hunfeld, I could hire anybody below the rank of lieutenant colonel in a Germans. And for a police force, and a man wandered, he came into my office to talk to me, and he said he had been a German policeman, but he didn't want to join the party, so he joined the army. And he was a regimental commander in the Soviet Union, but now he's looking for a job as a chief of police. I said, well, you know, this is a rural county, Hofmeister, you know, and you're very sophisticated. He said, I'll be all right. And he was. He was a very good man. He got along very well with the people. He had a great police force, and when he finally ended up, as I understand, as the chief of police of the whole state of Hessen. So there were a lot of good people that came in. And now at Fulda, we occupied the Bishop's Palace. And now from reading this book that Joe Nolan gave me on how the Irish saved civilization, right near my office in Fulda was the oldest church in Germany, built in 700-something by St. Boniface, who was one of the Irish monks that came into Germany. From there, I went to Marburg, and my duties were expanded a little bit in Marburg. But I had an interesting time there because it was a university town, and it was a conservative town. It was Protestant. One day, some military government officials came to me in Marburg, and by now I've been a captain. They said, Captain Sembach, we're going to tell you about an operation that's going to happen, and you're sworn to secrecy. Yes, sir. They said, you know, when the Americans came out of where is now the Russian zone, Soviet zone, they brought with them 4 caskets. And one of them was Frederick the Great, and the other is Frederick the Great's father. And then there's other 2 caskets are Field Marshal Hindenburg and his wife. Now, we have them over there in this place where they keep archives and whatnot for the university, but we've got to move them. And we're going to bury them in the floor of the St. Elizabeth Church. It's going to be a secret operation, but you're going to put the security screen around it. So I got the police chief, Ruperti, told him a certain day that something was going to happen there, get his policemen to ring around the church. Because these fellows from the State Department or part of the military government, they said there's going to be riots and everything when the Germans find this out. I thought, no, but we had to take the precautions. So the Hohenzollern family was brought down. I remember Prince Louis Ferdinand and his beautiful Russian princess wife, beautiful brunette, and there were, I think, Louis Ferdinand's sister, Cecilia, Princess Cecilia, and there was an older lady there. I just forget her name, but she was much higher in the royal rank than they were. The Hohenzollerns, so the Hohenzollerns were there, and then the Hindenburgs, Marshal Hindenburg's brother and sister-in-law and niece came down. So I got them all together and I told them, look, here where our enlisted men are, they have a mess hall and they have plenty of rooms. It's an old hotel. We have plenty of rooms and we have them all set up for you. We're going to take good care of you. Just make me one promise. Don't contact anybody until the ceremony's over. When the ceremony's over, I will let you contact anybody you want and I'll help you. But if we can make that sort of an agreement, everything will be fine. They agreed. So that morning we went to St. Elizabeth Church. The holes were dug in the floor and the caskets were put in there. And they were later moved someplace else. But we didn't have any demonstrations. Even when word was put out we didn't have any demonstrations. So I ended up at Marburg, and then I came home from Marburg. Went to West Point to teach military government and government history, geography, social sciences.
You had a wonderful experience over in Germany and were a very good administrator along with the other guys that you know. Okay, so after you taught at West Point, then I believe you got married.
Yeah, Chris and I got married while I was teaching at West Point.
Okay. And then you went to Korea in 1951?
Yes. First I had gone, yes, in 51, after some stateside duty, I went to Korea.
Just very briefly, what did you do in Korea?
I was a senior artillery advisor to the 97th Field Artillery Battalion, the Korean battalion, whom we activated on the 1st of November. And 6 weeks, went into training in some rear area. And by Christmas Day, we were in the line up the North Central Front.
But you were mainly working with some Koreans?
The Koreans. By then I was a major.
Okay. And then after the Korean War, if you came back, then you went back to Europe?
First I had 2 years at Governor's Island on the Army as a general staff officer. And then I went, I went to Europe. And I was in war plans in Europe for the G1, which is Personnel Administration. But our commanding general then was General McAuliffe. He had 4 stars.
And this was the guy you had...
This the guy was it was 1-star general in command in Bastogne.
Did you actually know General McAuliffe on a personal level?
Well, we got to know him a little better because my general was a paratrooper and an old-timer, General Aubrey S. Newman. And whenever he'd have a special problem that he had to brief the General McAuliffe on, he'd call, he'd say, "Get Major Sembach in here." And they'd brief me on this darn problem, and they'd send me over to the command building, and when General McAuliffe would see me coming, he'd say, "Oh, this must be a tough one. When General Newman goes so low as to send you over here," he said, "when am I going to repay my debt to all you Bastogne boys?" And I said, "Oh, no, sir, this is a real good one. We're on the right track on this one." He said, "Okay, let's hear it." But he was a wonderful man. General McAuliffe was a short man. He wasn't very tall and very easy to talk to. He was a good disciplinarian. I mean, he was tough. But he was just a wonderful human being also.
He was well-liked by it.
Well-liked, and he liked his men. He took good care of the troops. You know, when I think back on our battalion, being a corps battalion, we didn't get many medals or awards or anything. We were just kicked around and pushed around. But McAuliffe saw to it that some of the people got awards. He saw to it that our battalion got the Presidential Unit Citation, and he kept us with backing up his 101st Airborne until such time as they were pulled out of the line. And we were always, always well supplied, well taken care of by him. But as I said before, we were in bad shape after Bastogne, and we did a lot of moving. But he always did the best to take care of the troops that were in support of his division.
I know most of your artifacts got lost, but did you have medals that were anything outstanding or just... No, just the regular routine. For medals for being in that area. Okay. So then, when did you retire from the Army?
I retired 1964, took an early retirement. I was in the Pentagon at that time.
And you were what rank?
I was Lieutenant Colonel in the Army General Staff. Okay. Intelligence.
So then, all right, so now you're out of the Army in 1964, and then you had another career as a civilian? Yes,
when I was in the, before I went to the Pentagon, the Army had me volunteer for civil schooling in the physical sciences. So I ended up going, it was one of these either or. You either do what we ask you to volunteer, or else, you know. So you get the message real fast. So I went to the University of Virginia, got a master's in physics. So when I was in the Pentagon, I did a lot. I was in scientific intelligence committees of the United States Intelligence Board. And so when I retired, I drifted over into jobs that could use both my military and my mathematical background. So for a while I was with a wargaming outfit for about 4 years, and then I ended up with Computer Sciences Corporation, which was then starting out in 1968, and I stayed with them as a senior principal engineer until 1988, at which time I retired completely.
It's a long way from the coal mines in Pennsylvania.
It sure is. But I almost died on the coal pile at Alsdorf, and I'll never forget that.
Did you have any real close friendships from your war years?
No, not really, because the battalion, the 755th, broke up, and most of these people went back to civilian life. Captain Stanley went back to Alabama, you know, and some of the sergeants just went into the regular army, but I never bumped into them again in the regular army.
But you never kept in touch?
But I never kept in, they never had reunions or anything like that.
Okay. You did keep in touch with some of your West Point buddies?
Well, with those I do, yeah, and I've belonged to the Retired Officers Association and the Korean War Veterans Association, and that's been my main contacts.
Okay. How did your military experience influence your thinking about war?
Well, someone said war is hell, and it really is. Especially when you're out there in the front lines or when you're in the tanks. You live like a dog. You're scared. You do what has to be done. And it's not fun. There's not much fun killing other human beings, even though they're trying to kill you. So war is not a nice thing. I think you'll find that the greatest pacifists are the men who've been to war, been to combat. And if there's any way that things could be settled without going to that extreme, hopefully it would be done. Unfortunately, human nature is not that way.
Well, how did your service and your experiences in the service affect your life after the war?
Well, I think I learned to appreciate people that worked for me. You know, I was just a first lieutenant. When I've been in the Army as an enlisted man, I was just a private. I never commanded anybody. Then I was a first lieutenant. And you start understanding some things about your responsibilities as a leader, how you behave, and how you treat people, how you get the most out of your people. So it helped me that way, but it matured me too. The thing that matured me more than anything was the military government experience. So I learned a lot. I got a good education from the Army. I owe a lot to the Army. Yes, I could have died on the coal pile at Alsdorf, but I could have died at number 14 Calgary in Tamaqua, Pennsylvania.
Well, that's very, very interesting interview. Is there anything else that you'd like to add?
No.
Any other experience or anything else? Okay, well, thank you very much. It was very interesting.